This summer's issue of National Security Science magazine focused on history. It focuses on history as we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Trinity event. You're about to see a fascinating film in which Bradbury Science Director Linda Deck interviews the well-known historian Jim Kunetka and our very own historian Alan Carr. In this film, they will bring to life the challenges and steps that had to be taken to achieve the first atomic explosion at Alamogordo on July 16, 1945. When we think of history, we often think of dusty dog-eared reports in old collections, black and white photographs, and remember what has happened. Jim, Alan, and Linda are going to show you how important and vibrant the people were as they brought about this historical change that Trinity created. Trinity was the foundation of the need for big science in our country. And that foundation continues today in you, in the people across the country, as we work on thousands of complex problems, solving thousands of complex projects all the time. It's important to remember that we are making history today. We make history as we execute the Stockpile Modernization Program. We make history when we apply our supercomputers to the COVID-19 problem. We are the legacy of big science. We are the legacy of Trinity. I hope you enjoy the film.
The lab at the time was actually developing two weapons, and one was known as the gun bomb, and it simply fired one piece of uranium into another. And there was fairly high confidence. And uranium works in the gun, but plutonium does not. But the key really is that uranium-235 was extremely rare and very difficult to produce. Plutonium was increasingly available. And if ending the war was going to require more than a bomb or two, it was going to require bombs that used plutonium. But plutonium would not work, and it had to do with pre-detonation. So that's why they devised this implosion process. Never been done before. And there were many, many things that had to be worked out. And I think, frankly, they couldn't risk producing a bomb or many implosion bombs, sending them over to Japan, knowing that they may or may not work. And consequently, Trinity was one of 11 sites, I think, scattered around the country, was picked and was named. And we should ask Alan this about the origin of the name Trinity.
I think that Oppenheimer gave it its name. And there are a lot of different stories behind that. I've heard that Trinity may have received its name from a local mine, a story that I believe that they made up at the White Sands Missile Range, but they're open about making it up, is that it represented the culmination of the work of the three main sites, Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos. Great story, but it's totally not true. But I think that years later, when General Groves, who was in charge of the entire Manhattan Project, was writing his memoir, he wrote a letter to Oppenheimer saying, well, where did the name come from anyway? And I believe that Oppenheimer said, I don't remember specifically. I came up with the name, and I was reading John Donne's poetry at the time, and I believe that one of the poems included the line, three-personed God, or something like that. And so Oppenheimer did come up with the name, and he thinks that he was inspired by that John Donne poem, according to that letter, I believe.
It has a poetic ring.
It does have a poetic ring.
Right, right.
So when did the planning actually begin? It was a huge test. So when did they actually begin the planning for Trinity?
Really, the planning started in early 1944. As soon as the laboratory realized, as soon as Oppenheimer and the leaders understood that implosion was going to be a serious, or was likely to be a serious alternative to the gun weapon, they began planning for it. And I think Kenneth Bainbridge, who was essentially named as director of the test, that happened, I think, in the spring of 44, and probably not much later. And as we'll see as we talk about it, it was far much more elaborate and sophisticated. The story of Los Alamos, which is so rich and so complex, it's easy to get caught in all different aspects. But the Trinity test by 1945, and probably by the spring, was consuming maybe a third or perhaps even close to a half of all the resources. Because the gun weapon was pretty well developed by that point. I think you would agree, Alan.
I do agree. It was a big deal. I mean, the reason that they didn't do implosion in the first place is because it was more complicated. It's a much more efficient way to make an atomic bomb, but it was more complicated. When you look at something like implosion, you're taking high explosives and trying to make, certainly by the standards of today, a very crude material react in the exact opposite way that it was intended. And so explosives are supposed to expand, releasing energies. We want them to implode upon themselves. It was really complicated. You've got to have symmetry, perfect symmetry of your implosion. It had to be done very quickly too, of course, because at this time we were in a race, we thought, with Hitler to build an atomic bomb. The Germans and the Japanese both had nuclear weapons programs, and you've got over 300 Americans being killed in combat every single day of the war as well. So it had to be done quickly. It was very complicated. And I don't think today, we've done, it's been since 1992, of course, since we did a full-scale nuclear test, but we've tested over 1,000 nuclear, we've done over 1,000 nuclear tests. It's very easy to take for granted the fact that it had never been done before, as Jim talked about. Everything was unprecedented. Nobody had set one off before. Where do you do it? How do you set it off? How do you transport a nuclear weapon safely? Et cetera, et cetera. So it was just every aspect of this, and that's why I think so many people were involved in trying to get this done.
So I'm intrigued. I'm going to ask something else. So my understanding is it was the crisis of '44 that caused the reorganization of the laboratory around specifically perfecting implosion, because it was such an intricate method to be perfected. And that was in the summer of '44. That was in August.
The reorg, yes.
The reorg. But when did Segre deliver his bad news that plutonium's never going to work in a gun-assembled design? And is that when they began thinking about not only getting more thoroughly into implosion, but also the need to test it?
So I want Jim to tell that story, but I want to put a plug in because in his book, if you don't mind, General and the Genius, I got to listen to that on audio. And I drove up Pajarito Road for those who work at the laboratory. And so driving down Pajarito Road, I got to hear the story as told in Jim's book as I drove by the sites where it actually happened. And so that does go back to, that goes back to the spring of '44.
Yeah.
And do you want to tell that story? Because it's great in the
Go
book.
ahead. No, because I think you know the area better. You're exactly right.
Yeah, it was, so I mean, that was just, I couldn't help myself having a big grin on my face driving by Technical Area 18. And so we had 18 Nobel laureates on our staff back then. Most of them would win the prize later in their careers for work that was completely unconnected to Los Alamos, but we had a lot of bright people here. One of them was Emilio Segre. And so Segre performed experiments down at Technical Area 18, which is now part of the Manhattan National Historic Park complex, that revealed the pre-initiation problem that Jim talked about earlier. They had been thinking about implosion before then, and but it was a sideshow. And I do think sideshow would be a fair...
No, I think it's accurate.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I've called it a sideshow Oppenheimer tolerated, because remember, you're trying to get this job done really quickly. You need everybody contributing to the most successful course to getting this done. And so to let people look at this other stuff it's pretty surprising that they did, but this was led, this small group was led by a man named Seth Nettermeyer, very good physicist. I believe Edward Teller, who would go on to found Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, one of the father of the hydrogen bomb. He was doing work in this area as well. What they were doing was they were taking cylinders of material, wrapping them in high explosives, setting them off, and trying to compress them. Now, overnight, this little sideshow becomes the main effort of the laboratory. And again, in General and the Genius, as I recall, there's this great retelling of this meeting that Oppenheimer has, because it takes them time to get organized, to get a plan, to figure out what they're going to do. No longer is it going to be Seth Nettermeyer and a few guys. Instead, Oppenheimer creates two entirely new divisions to do this work, because it's that big a deal. And so the old physics division kind of goes away, and he creates the weapons physics division, which is known as G division for the gadget division. They're going to do all of the physics related to this new weapon. And he creates an explosives division. This is the original X division at the laboratory. The weapons physics is going to be led by Robert Bacher, who is also the de facto deputy director of the laboratory. It was not an official position, but Oppenheimer is going to take kind of the second in command, who had been the division leader for physics, put him in charge there, and George Kistiakowsky is going to lead the explosives division. Because again, to try and take a crude material to act in the opposite way that it was intended and designed for, to do it quickly, to do it with precision, it was just a monumental task. And so, as you mentioned, Linda, the formal reorg, I believe, was in August of 1944, and this is successfully tested less than a year later,
yes,
and put into combat 1 year later.
Yes.
Just it's remarkable.
It is remarkable. So when did the staging begin for the test? When did they begin going down there and scoping out the site?
Once implosion became the plutonium alternative, and again, it's just important to remember that the rate of production, the plutonium, primarily there were multiple sources, but the primary source were the reactors in Hanford, Washington. It was clear that the Los Alamos was going to receive in time much larger quantities of plutonium than uranium, but that's important. So implosion becomes this overnight priority when it's realized that the impurities, not only the atomic nature of plutonium, but the impurities, it simply could not be produced at a level of purity that would possibly make it, usable in sort of a gun device of some kind. So implosion becomes, planning begins because nobody is entirely comfortable. And that often told analogy is if you take an orange, which is roughly the size of the heart of the ultimate Fat Man bomb, the gadget of the plutonium. If you take that orange and you try to squeeze it, inevitably parts of it are going to spill out because you can't compress it uniformly. So if you think about taking something the size of a tennis ball perhaps, or perhaps a little larger, and as Alan has pointed out, compress that uniformly and symmetrically and exactly at the same time, it's an enormous challenge because it's never been done before. So the planning then, knowing all of that, a test is almost inevitable and it begins to gain strength. And so it was in the fall that a series of, one of Groves's lieutenants traveled all over the country and they considered a number of different sites. One of them was an island off the coast of Texas, Matagorda Island. But there were places in Oregon, there was a place in Colorado, but for a variety of reasons, the Tularosa Basin was chosen. It was isolated and large parts of it were already occupied by the Alamogordo Army Air Base, which thousands, I think 50 or 60,000 acres. So acquiring land for the test would have been obvious. But construction, the first team actually appeared on January the 1st, 1945 at the Trinity site in the midst of a snowstorm. And then all the rest, all of the buildings, all of this stuff was all put together then essentially in the next, 7 months and a week.
When you're looking at heroes of the Manhattan Project, when I give talks, I often mention the construction workers. Those were that was the most common job of the Manhattan Project. There was no Hanford, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos. And I think sometimes we take for granted the amount of physical infrastructure that was necessary for the Trinity test. I mean, they built bunkers. They built multiple towers. There's of course the famous 100-foot steel tower for the main test, but they built the 100-ton test tower as well. They built a tower that they suspended Jumbo from. I think that they paved, 2 or 3 dozen miles of road. All kinds of different cabling for diagnostics were put there. It was a big, big project just to get the site prepared to do the test. They didn't just take it out into the desert and boom.
No. So you've anticipated my next question, which is, what were the various facets of the test, the various activities that needed to be completed? And do we have records of that says there was this division that went out and did this and this to make these things happen?
We do have a lot of documentation. Jim has been able to explore a lot of it personally through the Freedom of Information Act, and we have other publicly releasable records from the laboratory archives.
So what do we know, Jim?
Well, I think it's important, again, and very simplistically, the two things that Los Alamos needed to know with the test is the most obvious. We know, would the device work? Well, it did. But then I think the second is, how efficient was it? And that has many different dynamics. So they were looking at, the production, what kinds of, nuclear byproducts would be produced. And if you've got, and there's a public figure given that's out in the public domain, that the plutonium sphere was about 13.5 pounds. There's no secret there. The question is, how much of that 13.5 pounds actually was utilized effectively in the actual explosion? And that's one of the things that they sought to determine. So in addition, there might have been, there were paved roads, there were dirt roads. It was an elaborate setup. And there were probably, I don't know, there could easily be 4,000 or 5,000 miles of wire that had been strung all over, leading to different bunkers. And just to set the record correct, because just having come from the Trinity Open House and hearing all kinds of tales and myths, the closest that any human being was to the test was 10,000 yards. There was nobody closer. And many, many more people were even farther back. And Los Alamos had very thoughtfully placed strategically people all around in the community looking as a precaution, looking for radioactive fallout. So it was really, I think what strikes me as a historian is that Trinity has and this might be a question that you might ask is, what's the legacy? The legacy is twofold. It's the same legacy that Los Alamos shares, the laboratory shares. On the one hand, it's the sort of the more pragmatic side is both Los Alamos and Trinity, Los Alamos developed the bomb and Trinity tested the bomb. So that's part of the legacy. The other legacy, and the legacy that's actually more significant and has more impact in the long term on human beings, is the scientific impact. And I think what strikes me as a historian is just how sophisticated this test was, how much thought was given to it, and the amount of resources. It's very difficult to calculate dollars, but I wouldn't be surprised if the overall cost of Los Alamos during the war, of the Manhattan Project, was about $2 billion. Los Alamos is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 112, maybe to 120 million, which seems insignificant today, but was quite substantial then. It's quite possible that setting up Trinity, that alone in wartime dollars might have been $15 or $20 million, because it was so elaborate. And today, almost 75 years later, there are still parts of that test. There are bunkers and even parts of the desert. It's very touching that these wires still lie on the surface and they all lead in a line to ground zero. It's very impressive.
So what were the various facets of the test?
Safety. A lot of effort went into both of those. Now keep in mind, the Manhattan Project is not only maybe history's most secret project, but it's a big project too that employs over 100,000 people simultaneously at places all over the country. How do you keep that secret? Now we get to the culmination, which is the Trinity test. How do you keep a nuclear test secret? Yeah. And so there was a fair amount of consideration that went into that. And so just in terms of security, very quickly, how are we going to keep it secret? Well, we're setting off a blast in New Mexico. Not a lot of people there. It's on an Army base. Not a lot of people there either. So that's good. So just setting this thing off where there aren't that many people living, that's good. Second thing, let's set it off at 4 in the morning because nobody will be awake. Not that many people are awake at 4. Wouldn't want to let that slide to 5:30 or something like that because there might be a lot of people milling about by then. But it's these simple things like let's do it on an Army base, let's have physical security. They patrolled the area with jeeps and on horses and things like that. You couldn't mention Los Alamos having a connection to the Trinity test. Very few people knew that all that work, all the construction going on at Trinity had any connection to all the work going on at Los Alamos. And the connection between the two was itself classified. So that's kind of what they were doing for security. Now, what if enough people see it that they have to acknowledge that something happened? Well, they had a plan for that, and that was that they did have a press release prepared. And when we talk about the actual test in a few more minutes, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail. But the press release said, an ammo dump at the Alamogordo bombing range blew up. Nobody was hurt. Nothing to see here, and it's on page 7. Go about with your lives. Now, that kind of transitions us into the safety aspect of this. Nobody had ever set off an atomic bomb before. Now, you will hear people say, oh, well, the scientists were ignorant, they didn't know what they're doing. Well, that's not exactly true. I mean, the scientists recognized that these were hazardous materials. They took precautions at the laboratory, and they took precautions with this test. Now, they didn't know the full magnitude of working with these materials. For instance, there were virtually no long-term effects studies of working with this type of material. So they had to kind of make guesses. And now, when they were planning the Trinity test early on, they didn't think that this was going to be much of a safety problem at all. Now, when they did the rehearsal test, I believe it was on May 7th, 1945, is known as the 100-ton test. They set off 100 tons of TNT, lace it with radioactive isotopes, which they could trace. They had the monitors around the state, and they figured out that this was going to be a bigger problem than they thought. And so they had an evacuation detachment. I think Jim will have some more to tell you in detail about who some of the radiation monitors were, or who they were and where they were and things like that. But we had people who put themselves in harm's way to make sure to try and protect the populace. Now, here's the thing. Let's say that the radiation levels reached a certain point that they were not comfortable with based on their studies at that point in time. What's the cover story for that? And thus we had press release number 2. A ammunition dump with gas shells blew up at the Alamogordo bombing range. Nobody was hurt. The citizens of this city were evacuated for 48 hours to make sure that they would be safe. That was how they handled security and safety. Pretty basic measures, but pretty effective ones had the need arose. And we can talk about that more later if you would like to. But when I'm thinking about Trinity, I'm thinking about things like that. And of course, the Trinity experiments. Jim mentioned trying to assess the efficiency of this new weapon. Other things were, how much yield is it going to produce? Because when we do talk about, scientific experiment versus combat test in a little while, we'll talk about that a little bit more. It is a combat weapon. And so we're going to unleash a new weapon on a target. We want to know what it's going to do. How do you know how powerful it's going to be? Because you need to kind of know that to how high do you want it to hit the ground? Do you want to set it off above the target? All of these different things. So measuring the yield was going to be an important aspect of that. And we used cameras to do that a lot, some of which you can see here at the Bradbury Science Museum. We want to get lots of good film and photos so that we can measure the fireball and get a precise yield so that we know how to properly use it in combat. And again, when you're talking about fission, and later, in years to follow, fusion, you're simulating things that happen in nature which had never been done on Earth before. And so you get this glimpse into how everything works. And so there was a lot of curiosity about that as well. So there were a lot of experiments, a lot of reports were published, a lot of them are publicly releasable and can be read on the laboratory's library website.
I think you just answered what was going to be my last question in this little series. What, besides seeing and recording the tremendous explosion, did its accomplishment provide to the project? You just touched on many of those. Jim, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think he caught it. I would add something, though, about security. And again, I'm going to speak now as a historian, and it's one of the there's more often a joy. As a historian, the joy is more often in ferreting out the detail than actually writing about it. Although some writers will tell you the real joy is when you cash the royalty checks. But I had the privilege in the late 70s and early 80s of actually being an unpaid consultant here, and I had a security clearance, and I was able to go through a lot of wartime documents. And I just want to add to them a couple of stories about the safety. It was meticulously thought through so that anybody going down to Trinity had to, here in Los Alamos, had to sign in, obtain a card, go down. That card was turned in as they entered the Trinity area. It had to be reclaimed. And as the test neared, specific individual assignments were made at each location. And part of that was the obvious. They wanted to account for people. So that will tell you again the level of thoroughness, how cleverly this was thought out. But here's what's interesting to the historian. I actually looked at a number of those lists. So here's a list of people who were expected to be at the north 10,000 bunker, 10,000 yards away. There were 3 major ones, and the control bunker was in the south, and it was the largest, and that's where Oppenheimer, by the way, was. That also, and then somewhat farther back was base camp. And so I looked at the list of names. Now, in the course, I started my research in the 1970s. I really am an old guy here. Interviewing people, and good fortune, though, many of the wartime participants, just a very large number of them were still alive. So even some of the senior people, Bob Barker, John Manley, Emilio Segre, all these people I was able to talk to. But then they had their own take, but I found a lot more, there was a lot more human detail as you sort of went down that ladder. But in the course of interviewing people specific about Trinity, I had numerous people tell me that they witnessed a very well-known and publicized account of Enrico Fermi. The blast goes off, and everybody turns around, and he tears up a piece of paper and scatters it as the blast comes. He looks at the distance that the paper travels, and he guesstimates. Actually, it turns out fairly inaccurately, but nonetheless, he does make a guess. So when I made a note of all of this, and then when I went back to, I copied, who was where, I actually discovered many of these people were not in the position of saying it. And it tells you something about memory, the nature of memory, and why paper documentation is often so important. And I have to wonder about the historians of the future who are going to be trying to track down, social media, memos that are digital. What's going to happen? How will we record and talk history in the long run? So, but to your question, I think there were so many different things, and there were so many clever experiments. They actually, a team went down to Fort Bliss, and they actually purloined some barrage balloons. And they came back because in the day before, this is Sunday now, in the late afternoon, they lifted these. The test was expected to go off first at midnight. As we know, it went off at 5:30. But they lifted up the balloons with a series of devices to pick up pieces of, to detect, various kinds of radiation. And they attached them to Jeeps because they thought that would be fairly heavy. But with the storm that came through, the Jeeps began to bobble up. And these people, in the middle of the storm, some of these young men had to go out and sit in the Jeep to keep the Jeep from bobbling up and down. So, and trenches were dug, miles of cabling. I think you could write, in fact, there are probably, I didn't see them, I'm not sure I would even be able to work my way through now, volume after volume about these tests and the preparation. Suffice to say, there were literally hundreds. There was a committee in Los Alamos. It was chaired by Ken Bainbridge, so that any scientist who had an idea, who said, I'd like to look at this, could come to the committee, present his idea, and they would say yes or no. And if they said yes, that individual or that team then had to present a list of supplies needed, because it might involve a small concrete bunker where they could put their instruments, but that would only be 2,000 yards from ground zero. So it would have to be doubly protected or very low to the ground. So it was a highly imaginative and well thought out experiment, a grand experiment.
I will say this for Fermi. We have his original typed up notes when he talks about that experiment. It's a paragraph over at the laboratory National Security Research Center. And he predicted it was 10,000 tons equivalent, and it was 21.
It was 21.
And so I mean, with a blank sheet of paper on the fly,
It wasn't bad.
I don't think it's that bad. So.
No, but people, the history's odd, and again, this is it. There are many stories about this, obviously, but quite a number of them, unfortunately, say that he guessed correctly the level, and
Right.
he didn't. But
he was off.
He was only off by half. But if I had guessed,
I wouldn't have done
I
that
think
well.
Teller guessed 100 tons, 100 million. No, somebody made some outrageous guess. I think because there was a pool, and they just
Yes, you
figured
could
if
buy
they had
into
the
the
top
pool.
and nobody else came close, they would win the pool. So because everybody put in $1 or something.
This is a great recounting, just to give us sort of this general gist of what we're talking about in terms of Trinity. So the sheer scope of Trinity, the first scientific experiment in history at this scale, likely set the standards for all future large scientific endeavors. How so?
Well, I think both of us can contribute in different ways to this. The standards were set because of the thoroughness of the planning and the consideration of all aspects, including safety. So in one particular area, obvious of concern to Los Alamos, virtually all future tests, whether they were done in the atmosphere, airdropped or on the ground or underground, all owe the origins of the planning to the planning for Trinity. But beyond that, what it set in motion were a series of considerations that every grand experiment, so even the early rocket tests at White Sands with the captured German V-2 missiles, drew on the experience in terms of setting up a series, an array of cameras and detectors, of having essentially a launch sequence and a plan that would go down to the very second. And all of that can go back to Trinity. And I think in many ways, and I would enlarge Trinity in my mind is inseparable historically from Los Alamos. Los Alamos is the birthplace, I think, of the grand scientific endeavor. And I have no doubts in my mind that Neil Armstrong and his companion were on the moon in large thanks to what happened here at Los Alamos.
Well, I don't know if I can top that answer. I'll throw in a couple of thoughts, though. Trinity was a test of a combat weapon. This was before no such thing existed as nuclear deterrence. This was not a bomb developed as a deterrent. It was developed as a weapon to go into combat, and this was the proof test to make sure that weapon worked. And I think that first and foremost, that's what it was. But that's not the only thing that it was. I do think that there's a strong case to be made that Trinity was the single most significant scientific experiment maybe of all time. When you start to think and I think that the Manhattan Project produced 2 of at least the top 5. The other one being Fermi's chain reaction at the University of Chicago shortly before he came here to Los Alamos. These changed history. And with Trinity in particular, it really did, I think, represent the culmination of decades of research in many different fields. We think of physics, again, first and foremost, but when you think of metallurgy and chemistry and all of these other things that went into this test that fundamentally changed the world forever, I do think that there's a very strong case for that. And I agree with Jim. I think that the Manhattan Project as a whole, if you will, and again, Trinity being its culmination point, I think anyway, it established, I think, an unprecedented template for government, academia, corporations working together. Now, those things had happened before, but never on that scale. And so when you do look to the Apollo program or the Human Genome program and things like that, I think that when you're talking about that scale of cooperation, it does go back to the Manhattan Project, and Trinity is representative of that success on how these entities can work together to do something that none of them on their own could do.
I think, Alan, you make some good points. I would add only one thing. I agree, by the way, it may be the single most important experiment. I would think, in an odd way, but significant way, it also reflects America at the time. The way the way the laboratory was constructed and organized, the freedom to be able to exchange ideas, much fought over, as you know, early on. Groves would have preferred isolating everybody in silos and not speaking to one another, except maybe a little bit at the very top. You know, the good news is that there was this cross-fertilization. The bad news, of course, is that people like Klaus Fuchs learned a lot more than he would have had he been just in a theoretical silo. On the other hand, look at what we achieved. And it really does reflect this kind of American notion that if we all push in, because the German experience, the German atomic bomb experience really, it was never as well funded, obviously. The V2 and the V1 missiles were probably the biggest scientific achievements for Germany. But the atomic bomb, the nuclear program failed because it was structured in a way in which the younger men simply could only do the bidding of the older men. And there was not a lot of imagination. The bomb that they were considering apparently involved sort of creating something like a reactor that would be made to explode. They, in fact, as you know, many of them, including Heisenberg, who were captured after the war, were taken to England and they were housed in a mansion and sort of a castle, and they were taped secretly. And when news came of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they simply couldn't believe it, because in their experience it wouldn't have been possible. They just simply couldn't have imagined it. Yeah. And I think again it reflects, you know, American ingenuity. We can thank Hitler for sending us people like, you know, Edward Teller and Hans Bethe and Segre and all the Fermi. And I think we can say, you know, we can thank Groves for trusting Oppenheimer. We can thank Oppenheimer for his brilliance and the leadership. And we can thank the brilliance and the hard work of all the other young men and women who contributed to make a success. And it happened right here on this Mesa top, and then in the annex down in Trinity. How far away is Trinity? 144 miles, something like that?
Ooh, mileage.
200?
Let's see. So, you know, we measure things in distance in hours in Texas.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
So it's 3.5 hour drive from here.
Right.
Yeah, so that's about how far it is, 3.5 hours.
Right. Right. No, that is so true, though. I agree wholeheartedly with that. You know, the United States, when you look at our history, there's a lot of firsts that this country has produced, and this was one of them. And a lot of, you know, you mentioned several things. I mean, at that point in time, I believe 11% of the workforce was comprised of women doing important, meaningful work. There's a lot of countries where that just wouldn't have been able to happen at that point in time. We still had a long way to go before we could really recognize the potential of the other half of the population, right? But I think we were, you know, you wouldn't have seen that in a lot of places. You saw somebody in General Groves, who I think really is the hero of the Manhattan Project. I think that Oppenheimer really grew in Groves's image. He had to, and to his credit. But Groves was the boss, and he could be gruff, and he could be mean, but he could also be flexible. He could also admit when he was wrong, I think. He didn't like to, none of us do, but you know, he was willing, he wanted this to be an Army base, as Jim said, and he listened to the scientists, and they decided that wasn't the way to go. They made that change. That, I don't think, would have happened in another country. Not only did we have a lot of foreign national scientists here as well during the Manhattan Project, but we had a lot of foreign national scientists from sensitive countries, as we would call them today, who, and I think that a lot of times you will find that those folks are the most dedicated to mission because they've seen how bad it can be.
Yes,
and so we had
true.
Germans and Italians, Hungarians from all of these Axis countries who came here, and that remains a hallmark of the laboratory. We have people from all over the world who have made important contributions by the thousands of people from foreign countries who've made important contributions at the laboratory. And again, to me, I think that is something that as a nation we can look at and be proud of and seek to emulate as we continue to advance.
It sounds like you're saying it represented in a way the democratization.
It does. Yes, well said. That captures it. You know,
research.
In addition, at the open house at Trinity on Saturday, I was explaining to somebody, you know, they asked, well, what was the significance of Trinity? And I was trying not to talk in quite the way we were here. And the person was sort of nodding, and it finally dawned on me that trying to talk about science and experiments and, you know, planning, all that, it wasn't unimportant. It wasn't something that meant something. I said, you know what's significant about Trinity? Is that you're looking and the ground zero is, you know, it's about 30 yards away. It's marked by this ugly obelisk. And I said, you know what's significant about this place? And they said, what? I said, when you're standing here, you're looking at the spot where, and I can't think of another place in the world, in world history, another location, and any other time in history, in which history changed not in a second, but in a microsecond. Now you have battles, you have Waterloo and Gettysburg, and God knows all the horrible things that human beings have done, but those are played out at best over hours and more than likely over days. History, yes, does change. You have the assassination of people like Kennedy, or you have any of these events, but all of those are played out. And in that particular spot, you're able to see where history changed like that, actually faster than that. That's not even fast enough.
Yes, yes.
And that made sense, and then they went away smiling. I should have gotten a candy bar for that.
That's pretty good.
It is an interesting site to visit because,
Yes, it is.
in a sense, if you go to George Washington's house, you go to George Washington's house. At Trinity, there's essentially nothing there from the test because it was a bomb going off.
Yeah.
So there's no tower. Jim and I had the really the pleasure of getting a VIP tour of the site by another one of our friends.
Alan arranged this. I was
No,
tag along.
this was Jim Kunetka,
No.
because he can work this with our friend Jim Eccles, who worked in the public affairs office there for years and wrote a book on Trinity, available on Amazon. So look that up.
Little paperback, very good.
as well. And so we got to visit. The camera bunkers are still there, and I believe it was the. Was it the west camera bunker?
Yes.
I think that the north bunker was where a lot of the cameras were. We went to the west bunker, which was kind of on a rise, and you could look down at the Trinity site and you could still see, when you're actually there, you kind of take it for granted that you're sitting in a little bowl that's still kind of burned off, maybe more from pedestrian traffic than the actual test. But when you get kind of that perspective looking down on it and you can kind of see that there's something still there, I think that's where I got my sense of place, was probably at the, I guess it was 10,000 yards away.
Because
looking
you
at
are
it.
on that rise, and as you look down, and of course all the bunkers are directly aligned with ground zero, and they have portholes. So if you look through them, you know you're looking essentially at ground zero. And what's interesting is that even after we did this a couple of years ago, after 73 years, in this slight rise, there's a thin little line of bleached sand that is still there. In order to get to you join the White Sands Missile Range people. So you have to get up at 6 o'clock in Socorro and you drive out. They don't let the public in until 8 o'clock. And there was that moment where the sun begins to rise, and it was just, I have to admit, it gave me the chills,
Yeah.
because
Yes.
that's about as close as you get after 74 years to that moment in time.
I've never had the chance to view it from the 10,000 yard bunkered areas.
should.
That would be very interesting.
It was a
I'd love to
rare
do it.
treat.
And
It was rare.
Jim Eccles, his book is called Trinitite, if I'm not mistaken.
Or I think it's just, is it
right?
just Trinity?
It's yes, and it's a book. He publishes it himself. It's very good. It's a great introduction. It's not a great deal of science. It's really more about Trinity, the place, and it's kind of the history of the
All
place
the
and so
questions
forth.
he's got
okay.
over all the
Yeah.
years, he
Got
answers
it.
in this book.
Yeah,
and
so it's really
it's
good.
great.
It's a fun thing.
Remember, this was the test of what needed to be a deliverable weapon. So now, compare, please, the Trinity gadget with the Fat Man weapon that followed. Was it, as some have argued, just a large scientific experiment, or was it really that test of that weapon?
I guess to answer that, some things that come to mind are the reflections of people who were there at the time. Now, the test gadget was just that. This was not a full system test. It wasn't dropped out of an airplane like it would be in combat. So, it was weaponized. We had a division down at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. It was called Z Division. Norris Bradbury, who the museum is named after, was one of the group leaders there. He was also in charge of kind of putting we talked about Kenneth Bainbridge, who was the test director. Norris Bradbury did a lot to make sure that the Trinity test was a success as well. I really like, I don't have this verbatim, but he basically said, you'll hear these folks say all these ethereal things about Trinity. He said, the damn thing worked and we were at war. And I think that captures the sentiment of a lot of people who were
Yes,
there.
absolutely.
I think maybe the single best quote, if you're looking for a concise quote to talk about this event, scientific event, combat weapon test, things like that, Victor Weisskopf has my favorite. Very succinct. He said, at first we were elated. Then we were tired. They hadn't slept in who knows how long. And he said, then we started to get scared. Because again, this is not about nuclear deterrence. This is about a new weapon that's going to go into warfare. And he's seen World War I, in which 12, 15 million people were killed. World War II would ultimately claim the lives of 60 to 80 million people. They're thinking about World War III with this new weapon in the arsenals of multiple countries, and they're horrified by it. The ride back to Los Alamos was apparently a somber one. When they got back, Stan Ulam, who was one of our mathematicians who was here, he didn't go to the Trinity test, and he said, you could just see it on their faces, that their whole outlook on everything had just changed. They had a lot of time to think about it very quietly as they came back. And so I don't know if anybody really predicted nuclear deterrence and tactical nuclear weapons and mutual assured destruction eventually and things like that at the time. But I think that they were very scared because of this new era. And so, on the one hand, you've got this new era in human history in which you can make all of this energy, which you can turn into electricity or this or that. We're going to have so much electric power that nobody will even get a utility bill anymore. It's going to be great. And on the other hand, it's like, well, yeah, if we make it that far. What happens if World War III, again, this is what Oppenheimer gave a speech that he basically improvised just down the street from here at Fuller Lodge in October of 1945. And he said, this new weapon has got to show us, as the human race, that war cannot be used to solve problems anymore. Now with weapons like this, we've got to come up with a better way. And I guess we didn't, and we haven't, and hopefully someday we will, but nuclear weapons kind of evolved into the time buying. I think, again, if Norris Bradbury were here, he would say the time buying role that they have until we do come up with a better way to try and keep the peace. But it is a timeless story. But when you look at Trinity, at least for us at the laboratory, that's kind of the culmination of our work. We did play a lot. Let's not dance around the role or the fact that these were used multiple times in combat against Japan, against Hiroshima, against Nagasaki. I think that they did play a significant role in ending the war. There were other factors as well that should not be overlooked. But I do think that these were probably the single most significant factor in ending the war when it did. But, Oppenheimer and the other scientists recognizing what was going to happen. You hear Oppenheimer's quote from the Bhagavad Gita, and it's often misinterpreted. Another one of our fellow nuclear historians, if you will, Peter Wellerstein, wrote a good article about this. When Oppenheimer talks about the 8-armed, or I guess the multi-armed god of war, saying, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, he doesn't see himself as that. He sees himself as the prince. So in that story, you've got a prince who needs to go to war, but he doesn't want to because he knows what all war entails, and he knows how horrible it is. But he's got to do it. And so to try and impress the prince, the god of war takes on his multi-armed form and says, I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds. Oppenheimer saw himself as the prince. He knew that this needed to be done, but he wasn't excited about it. He probably, more than anyone else in the world, maybe, knew what was going to happen when those bombs went off over a populated area. He was not excited about it.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
That was a burden that a lot of scientists who brought this technology into the world carried with them. Norris Bradbury was one of them. He wanted to, as deterrence evolved, he was very clear, he didn't like nuclear weapons. He looked forward to the day when they would not be needed to keep the peace anymore. But he also recognized, well, it looks like this might be a key ingredient in rendering these horrible global wars obsolete. maybe they buy us time until we can come up with something better and more permanent way of doing that.
Well, you know, in less than a year, it will be 75 years, 3/4 of a century since Trinity and since the end of World War II. And I think already we can make an argument, and I think it's not without some merit, that as terrible as the weapons of World War II were, both weapons of Los Alamos, we've actually not fought a war at the scale and at the level of terror and destruction as World War II. So it's not like you would develop the weapons so that you could be able to say this, but in fact, in retrospect, certainly the Soviets knew, and we knew, that using these weapons in war would be catastrophic. And that may have led to a lot of, wasted energy and money and lots of smaller wars, but at least there were no big wars. And I think it does come back to that sort of paradox, or that duality, if you wish, that both Los Alamos and Trinity represent, sort of science on the one hand in that grand way, and human beings at their best and the most imaginative, working hard, very mindful of what they were doing. And on the other hand, what they were doing was producing a weapon of mass destruction. And they knew it. And yes, and I do like that quote. Bainbridge was asked, what his first reaction was. It's almost as good as Weisskopf's. As Bradbury's. He said, "I was just glad I didn't have to. If it had been a dud, I was just glad I didn't have to climb up and, disarm it." And I don't blame him. But in my own mind, I'm remembering something that one of the men who was at Trinity, a young man at the time, told me. And he and others were very taken with the notion. I don't know if this was universal. I haven't talked with everybody who was there, of course. But he was very taken with the fact that, the bomb goes off in the dark, 5:30, and just brilliant fireball, which is both awesome and beautiful and terrible, all of those things at the same time, and it's rising up. And, they're aware of the fact that it's sun-like. And then, the fireball, rises and begins to dim. And not that much later, the sun behind the Oscuro Mountains, the light is creeping over. So at this point, the fireball is gone, but the cloud, the remnants of the cloud there. And people are, at this point, still at the point of elation and, clapping, and probably, if they can, smoking cigarettes or drinking coffee. And then the sun rises the second time, and they're aware of that. And this young man told me, he described that situation, and he said, briefly, we, the scientists, we made the sunrise. And then he paused and he smiled and he said, God does it every day. And I think maybe that's the way I choose to see Trinity, is that it represents, God-like aspirations and achievements, but it's not God.
What are the larger meanings or implications of Trinity as we go forward? What else should we remember it for?
I think we remember it, like we've been talking, I think it represents science, it represents ingenuity and innovation, cleverness, and yet it's something you do in which it has a double edge. We must always be mindful. And I'll give you an example. Today there have been huge advances in genetics, and particularly in genetic altered, food crops. And it won't be long before we can produce genetically altered children. I think we need to be extremely cautious about that. Where on the one hand, that kind of science and technology might produce children, young children who are free from certain kinds of diseases or defects. On the other hand, it could be easily and greatly misused. And so I think that's probably the legacy. We just need to be mindful that on the one hand, we can achieve enormous things, wonderful things. Trinity led to the moon, but at the same time, all the good of men can be used for evil as well. The question always for the historian is, well, what does that mean? So for me, it's the dual thing. It's we can do this, but we can also do that. So, and it's that dilemma is always going to be there. Mm-hmm. But yes, and I think Alan made the case eloquently. It was, above all, it was a test of a weapon. Mm-hmm. It just happened to be clever.
And I guess that's the most basic, what does Trinity mean? Well, I think Trinity most likely meant more hasty end to the most terrible conflict in human history. I don't know how long the war would have gone on otherwise, if it would have been a few days or a few months. We all have our guesses based on different data points. There's discussion today about, well, we won the war anyway, which we would have won. I mean, it was just a question of how much time and how many people were going to die. Okay, we know that. We were sending a message to the Soviet Union or something like that. I think that was a serendipitous benefit. I have no problem with intimidating a regime as horrible as the Soviet Union was when you look at its track record. But the reason that we employed nuclear weapons was to end a war quickly, and it worked. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, no, you're right. And I think just to amplify that one point, the interest in it, this is true, and Truman writes about this in his diary, so we know this is what he thought. And Truman is not somebody who's writing a diary because he's expecting it. He's writing it for the future. He's literally capturing what he feels. He was interested in saving primarily, of course, American lives, but he also knew that if he could end the war swiftly enough, it would save Japanese wars. What struck me down at Trinity was the number of people who didn't realize that the United States was already preparing. It was more than 2/3 of the way through preparations for a two-pronged assault on the main islands of Japan. The first, November the 1st of 1945, and the second was in March. They had already amassed, they were moving people from Europe. They expected to employ about 500,000 men in that. Not all would land at the same time, and many of them would be backup. It was going to be the largest it was going to dwarf D-Day in terms of the Armada. And we knew from the way that the Japanese fought in all of the islands, but especially in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, that they would do everything they could, and they would sacrifice women and children if they needed to. And our leaders, and I think Marshall, Stimson, certainly Oppenheimer, all of them knew, that this was going to be a terrible weapon. But if it could end the war, in the end, no matter the cost in Japan, it would save lives, and it would save Japanese lives. Would you not agree?
Well,
I do. Go ahead.
And it would save, in a way, Japanese culture.
Yes, absolutely.
Because fighting to the last man, woman, and
it would
child,
disappear.
Yes.
We were prepared for those invasions too. And because they did not happen, all of the material that had been used, or was planning to be used to support our soldiers in that invasion, was used for the Japanese people after the war.
Yes.
And I think that one of the great stories that comes out of this terrible time is that, when you look at Japan, when you look at Germany today, these are long-standing allies, free countries, very much the opposites of what they were back then. And so the process to getting to that point was not easily achieved. But, again, going back to Trinity, and I guess maybe stepping away a little bit from the world stage and looking at the laboratories, when I think of what Trinity is for us here at Los Alamos, and for that matter, the other weapons laboratories specifically within the complex, Sandia, Livermore, Trinity is a responsibility. Trinity is our heritage. I wasn't there, nobody on the staff now anymore was there either. But that's something that our institution did. It's a reminder, it's a heritage, and it's a responsibility. It is a heavy responsibility for the laboratories as we did bring these as institutions into the world. The United States was the first and only country to use them in combat, and we want to make sure that we can do everything that we can, whether it is to maintain a credible deterrent today, or maybe something different and even better down the road. Maybe we invent whatever that new technology is, because I do think it's a technology, not an agreement. Because that's kind of how I think human nature works. I'd like to think maybe that new and better technology comes out of a laboratory, maybe Los Alamos or one like it. But it's something that we need to be mindful of. For instance, deterrence doesn't work if you forget what a nuclear weapon will actually do. And setting one off in Nevada is not really what one will do. Setting one off in a city is. And that is something that I hope that everybody who works here, regardless of what their job is, that they will be mindful of each day, is that we are in the business of trying to make sure that that doesn't happen here or anywhere else in the world ever again.
That would be something for every single person on the face of the earth to remember.
Hopefully so. Hopefully so. I think that To me, that's really what Trinity is.
So what do you think would be the very best activities or ways to commemorate Trinity?
Well, I think one is acknowledging it. It's important for us to remember, the old film that was in the Bradbury, I believe, The Town That Never Was. I don't think it mentioned Trinity, but I don't believe it mentioned Hiroshima or Nagasaki at all, if I'm not mistaken there. We can go check that out. That's on YouTube still. But first of all, we have to acknowledge that the past happened, whether it was the atomic bombings or the Trinity test itself. To me, people will get tied up in, should we use the term celebration or commemoration? And those are things that we're mindful of, as a museum director, as historians. We want to be careful how we choose our words. It was a monumental scientific effort. It should be remembered. Hopefully it will inspire us to remember what a place like this can do under duress in a very short amount of time. But at the same time, we have to recognize that, this test really, I think more than any other single event, represented a new era in human history. And that's saying something, because you don't have new advents of new eras happen every day. And that it is full of all the promise and peril. And I know that sounds trite, but it's true.
I think we need to be reminded of that.
Yes, we need to remember it, we need to be inspired, and we need to be humble, I think, in our approach, as Jim was alluding to, and looking at all of these other fields of science as well. Because most things that we come across can be harnessed for one of two purposes: to make things worse or make them better. And I think Trinity is really an example of that.
It's the sword of Damocles. And it's also, I think, I'm reminded too of Greek mythology. The humans were always asking for gifts from the gods, and the gods would occasionally comply. But whenever they did that, it was always double-edged. You had to be careful what you asked for. I've forgotten the Greek particular myth, the name of the character, a human being who fell in love with a goddess, and one of them, but he was a human, he was immortal. And so she begged on his behalf, Zeus, to make him immortal. And in typical Greek fashion, he was made immortal, but not ageless. So he was going to live forever, but he got older and drier and more desiccated, and it would go on forever and ever. That was the Greeks. And I think we need to be mindful. I think you hit it on the head. That I can speak as historian, and because I'm not part of the laboratory. I can speak of this wonderful scientific achievement, knowing as well that it also represented a bomb. And yes, and I think you rightfully pointed out it was a weapon intended to end the war, and we need to be mindful. But if that weapon did in fact end the war, and if it did play a significant part, and I think both of us agree that it did play a very, despite the revisionist, I think it was elemental in ending the war, then Los Alamos would have made its own gift to humankind, because it does so in the Greek fashion of saying, be aware, be aware, be aware.